My brother-in-law pushed me down the stairs, and my sister said, "You should have just given us the money." All that because I refused to pay off their debt. I went to my parents' house for help but collapsed on the porch, and what happened next left everyone in total shock. You know, it's a terrifying thing to realize your own family, your flesh and blood, could put you in a hospital bed. Because that's exactly where I ended up, thanks to a nightmare that started with my sister and her husband, a nightmare that almost cost me everything I'd ever built. My name is Lucas, and at 32, I thought I'd finally left the petty sibling rivalries behind. Mia, my older sister, always had a way with words, a knack for making her problems everyone else's responsibility. She's 2 years older, sharper, and frankly, a master manipulator. While I worked hard to build a quiet, stable life, steady job, small house, no drama, she married Brandon. And Brandon? From the moment I met him, I just knew. He had that too-slick charm, the kind that hides an ugly, calculating temper. Whenever they came to family gatherings, I could feel his eyes scanning the room, like he was weighing up what he could extract from each person. It gave me the creeps. The first real crack in my peaceful life appeared about 2 months ago, on a rainy Sunday. I was at my parents' house, just sitting at the kitchen table, when Mia burst in, Brandon trailing behind her. She didn't even say hello. Just dropped into the chair across from me and let out this dramatic sigh. "We need a favor," she declared, like it was already decided. Brandon leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching me with this unsettling stare, like I was a broken vending machine refusing his snack. They laid it out. They needed $25,000 to clear up some financial trouble. No real explanation, just vague talk about urgent debts and time-sensitive payments. I didn't need to ask to know it was probably Brandon's gambling or one of his doomed business ideas. I told them I couldn't just hand over that kind of money. Mia's tone instantly flipped from pleading to accusing. "You're doing fine," she snapped, as if having my finances in order was some kind of personal insult. "You have savings just sitting there while we're drowning. Don't you think family should help each other?" Then Brandon, who'd been silent, added in a low, chilling voice, "You'll regret not helping." It wasn't an outright threat, but it hung in the air, heavy and dark. I apologized, but stood my ground. I wasn't getting dragged into their mess. Mia stormed out, and Brandon gave me a look I'll never forget, cold, almost smug. Over the next couple of weeks, their requests turned into relentless demands. Texts late at night, "You've had time to think, right?" Calls from unknown numbers that went silent when I answered. I started avoiding family dinners, knowing they'd corner me. My parents, who usually stayed out of sibling disputes, actually told me I should just help them this once to get them off my back. I tried to explain that it wasn't just about the money, it was about boundaries, about the fact that if I gave in, it would never end. But they just saw me as stubborn. The real breaking point came one evening when Mia and Brandon showed up at my house, uninvited. I was on the phone when I heard the knock, hard, insistent. The moment I opened the door, Mia brushed past me like she owned the place. Brandon stayed on the porch, his voice already raised. "We need to talk," he said. "Not a request." I told them they couldn't just show up, but they ignored me. Mia started ranting about how they were out of options, how I was letting them sink. Brandon stepped closer, towering over me. "You can fix this right now. Write the check." I don't know if it was the stress of the past few weeks or the way Brandon's tone made it sound like a command, but I snapped. I told them both to leave and never to come to my house again. That's when Brandon's face changed. His jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought he might just walk away. Instead, he shoved me, hard, backward into my own hallway. I caught myself before I fell, but adrenaline was pounding in my ears. I ordered him out again, louder this time. After a tense few seconds, he finally left, Mia yelling over her shoulder that I'd regret this. I wish that had been the end of it, but things only escalated. The next weekend, my parents invited me for dinner. I hesitated, suspecting a setup, but I missed them. Maybe things had cooled. I was wrong. When I arrived, Mia and Brandon were already there. I didn't even have time to sit down before Mia launched into their financial situation in front of everyone. When I said I wasn't changing my mind, she stood up. If you cared about family, you'd have done the right thing by now. Brandon muttered something under his breath, but the smirk on his face told me it wasn't friendly. It was later that night, as I was leaving, that everything turned physical. I was halfway down the stairs when I felt a sudden, forceful shove from behind. My foot slipped, and I tumbled hard, my shoulders slamming into the wall before I hit the last few steps. Pain shot up my side, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I looked up to see Brandon at the top, arms folded, and Mia next to him, saying, "You should have just given us the money." Her voice was cold, almost bored, as if this was somehow my fault. My parents rushed over, asking what happened. But Mia was already spinning the story. He tripped. "It's not a big deal." I knew if I stayed there another second, I'd explode. So I told my parents I wasn't feeling well and left, clutching my side as I made it to my car. By the time I got home, the pain was worse, but I told myself I'd sleep it off. The next morning, I could barely move. That's when I decided I needed to talk to my parents alone, away from Mia and Brandon's interference. I drove over, my vision blurring more than once. By the time I pulled into their driveway, I was pale and drenched in sweat. I made it to the porch, knocked on the door, and that's when my knees gave out. When I came to, I was lying flat, my parents standing over me, and someone was shouting from inside the house. But it wasn't their voices that made my stomach twist. It was the words. The first thing I registered was my mom's voice, sharp and accusing, cutting through the haze. "Lucas, what is wrong with you?" she snapped, as if I'd just inconvenienced her rather than collapsed on her front porch. My dad was crouched next to me, but instead of checking if I was hurt, he was glancing nervously toward the living room like he didn't want to make a scene. I tried to sit up, but the pain in my ribs made me gasp. I just need a minute," I muttered, wincing. My mom folded her arms. "You're being dramatic. You probably skipped breakfast and now you're fainting all over the place." That's when I heard Brandon's voice from inside, low but not low enough. "Told you he's soft. Can't even handle a few stairs." Mia's laugh followed, sharp and humorless. "And yet he's sitting on all that money like a dragon on a pile of gold." My parents didn't say anything to defend me. In fact, my mom glanced back toward the doorway and rolled her eyes, as if silently agreeing with them. It was like I wasn't their son standing there, hurt. I was just the roadblock between Mia and her next handout. Eventually, my dad helped me inside, though helped might be too generous. He kept a firm grip on my arm, more like he was steering me toward the couch to get me out of the way. Mia was already seated at the dining table with Brandon, sipping coffee like it was just another morning. "Rough night?" she asked with that mock sympathy I'd grown to hate. I didn't answer, just lowered myself into the nearest chair. The pain in my side was a steady throb now, making it hard to focus. But I caught the way Brandon was watching me, studying me, almost as if he was waiting for me to say something he could twist. Breakfast was tense, mostly because Mia and Brandon steered every conversation back to their situation. My mom was playing mediator, which in her language meant siding with them while pretending to be neutral. "Lucas," she said at one point, "they've been under so much stress lately. You have to understand, they wouldn't be asking if it wasn't serious." I wanted to ask her how shoving me down the stairs fit into that narrative of desperation, but I bit my tongue. My dad kept his head down, focusing on his plate like the eggs were the most fascinating thing in the world. Mia leaned forward. "You're making this harder than it has to be. You know you could solve this in 5 minutes, right?" She slid a folded piece of paper toward me. It was a loan agreement she'd clearly prepared ahead of time, complete with spaces for my signature and bank details. I didn't touch it. "I already told you no," I said quietly. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might actually drop the act, but instead she glanced at my mom, who gave me that disappointed look I'd seen too many times growing up, the one that said I'd let the family down. Brandon finally spoke, his voice low and smug. "This isn't going away, Lucas. You think you can just ignore it, but you're going to wish you'd handled it the easy way." The worst part was the way my parents didn't react. Not to the veiled threat, not to the memory of what had happened on the stairs. Nothing. It was like they'd all silently agreed that I was the problem here. Every bite of food tasted like sand in my mouth. After breakfast, My mom pulled me aside in the hallway. "Just sign it," she whispered. "It'll keep the peace." I stared at her, stunned. "Keep the peace?" I repeated. "He shoved me down the stairs, Mom." She flinched, but not because of what I'd said. More like she was embarrassed I'd brought it up. "You probably just lost your balance," she said quickly. "No need to make accusations." That was the moment something in me shifted. If my own parents weren't going to acknowledge what happened, if they were willing to excuse it for the sake of avoiding conflict, then I couldn't trust them to protect me from whatever came next. I left not long after, ignoring Mia's overly sweet "Bye, Lucas" as I passed. My ribs hurt too much to drive straight home. So I pulled over at a quiet park and just sat there for a while, trying to process how quickly things had spiraled. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the realization that my family had chosen a side, and it wasn't mine. The more I thought about it, the more I could see all the smaller moments over the years where Mia had been favored, where I'd been expected to quietly absorb the unfairness for the sake of family harmony. That day marked the start of something different. I stopped answering Mia's calls altogether and let my parents' texts go unanswered when they were clearly fishing for updates. But the distance didn't stop them. It just made them bolder. The next time I saw my parents, my mom casually mentioned that Mia and Brandon had been helping around the house lately, repairs, errands, even paying for groceries. It was obvious what they were doing, painting themselves as the supportive children, while I was the selfish one. My dad, who rarely spoke up, added, "You know, it's not a great look, you staying away like this." It wasn't just the manipulation. It was the way they were rewriting the narrative in real time. I could feel the ground shifting under me. And I knew that if I didn't find a way to take control of the situation, I'd be the villain in every family story from here on out. And then came the day I got the call from my dad that changed everything. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was halfway through a work project when my phone lit up with his name. We rarely spoke unless something was wrong. So my first thought was that maybe his health had taken a turn. His voice was oddly calm, almost rehearsed. "Lucas," he said, "I need you to come over. There's something we need to talk about. It's about the house." "My house?" I felt a strange prickle at the back of my neck. "What about it?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "Just come over. We'll explain." That word, "we," made my stomach drop. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, Mia's car was already there. I walked in to find the three of them sitting at the dining table like they'd been waiting for me. My mom smiled tightly. "Good, you're here. We can all be adults about this." I didn't sit down. I stayed standing, looking from one face to another. Mia looked smug. Brandon's absence was conspicuous, but somehow made the air feel thicker. My dad wouldn't meet my eyes. Mia was the one who spoke first. "So, we've been thinking," she began, like this was a casual brainstorming session. "You have that house sitting there, mostly paid off, and we're in a bad spot with this debt. Selling it would cover everything and then some. You could rent for a while. It's just a house. You can always buy another one later." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the audacity was so staggering. "You're not serious," I said. My dad cleared his throat. "It would be the fastest way to resolve this situation," he offered quietly. "And it would help your sister and her husband get back on their feet." My mom jumped in with, "Think about how much stress it would take off the family." I stared at them, feeling like the floor had tilted under me. "You want me to sell my home?" "My home?" "To bail them out of a mess they made," I said slowly. Mia rolled her eyes. "It's not just for us, Lucas. It's for the family. We all benefit when everyone's stable." Her tone had that false generosity, as if she was doing me some kind of favor by letting me be the hero of her disaster. When I didn't answer right away, she leaned back and crossed her arms. "You know, you're making this harder than it has to be. If you're not going to step up voluntarily, there are other ways." That last sentence hit me harder than the shove down the stairs. I looked at my parents, expecting at least one of them to tell her she was out of line, but they both stayed silent. My mom's eyes flicked away. My dad rubbed the back of his neck. It dawned on me then. They'd already decided. This wasn't a request. This was them telling me what was going to happen. "What exactly does that mean?" I asked, my voice low. My dad sighed, finally meeting my eyes. We talked to a friend who's in real estate. There's interest in your property. If you put it on the market now, you could get a great price. Mia and Brandon have already spoken to a lender about their debt situation, and this would settle everything cleanly. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. You've been making plans to sell my house without even asking me? My mom's lips tightened. We thought you'd be reasonable about it. It's not like we're trying to hurt you. You'll land on your feet. You always do. Your sister needs this more than you do. That was the moment something in me went cold. It wasn't just the betrayal of them siding with Mia. It was the realization that they saw my stability as a resource to be harvested whenever she burned through hers. They didn't care what it cost me physically, emotionally, financially. To them, I was just a safety net. And if I refused to catch her, I was selfish. I told them no. Firmly. Finally. No explanations, no softening it. Just no. Mia's eyes narrowed. You'll regret this, she said again, like it was some mantra she lived by. My mom shook her head in disappointment, and my dad just looked tired. I turned and walked out without another word. But the whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that they'd find some way to push harder. And I was right, because 3 days later, I got home from work to find an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a letter from a property management company I'd never heard of, informing me that they had been retained to handle inquiries and negotiations related to the potential sale of my property. It was written in that sterile corporate tone that tries to sound friendly, but really just hides the fact that something's already in motion without you. My heart sank. I hadn't signed anything. Hadn't even agreed to meet anyone yet. Here it was in black and white. Someone had authorized them to start the process. I called the number listed, my voice tight, and after being transferred twice, I finally spoke to a manager. She cheerfully informed me that my family members had assured them I was fully on board and that they were preparing a listing packet. I cut her off immediately. That's not true. I never gave permission. There was a pause, then the carefully measured response. Oh, well, in that case, we'll hold off. But I'll need written confirmation from you to stop the file. Her tone made it clear she thought this was just a misunderstanding, but I knew better. This wasn't a mistake. It was a test to see how far they could go before I pushed back. I sat there in my kitchen with the letter in my hand, feeling the walls closing in. They hadn't just crossed a boundary, they'd bulldozed through it. And the worst part was knowing that if they'd been able to get their hands on any of my personal documents, they probably would have tried to forge my consent entirely. That week, I kept to myself more than usual. I ignored calls from my parents, left Mia's texts unread, and even blocked Brandon's number. But isolation has a way of making things heavier. Every time I walked through my house, I wondered how close I'd come to losing it without even knowing. Sleep became elusive. When I did manage to rest, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I heard someone at the door. My ribs still ached from the fall down the stairs, and the constant discomfort was a reminder that I wasn't just imagining their malice. My work started to suffer too. I'd sit at my desk staring at spreadsheets, the numbers blurring until I had to step away. Friends invited me out, but I found excuses to stay home. I didn't want to answer questions I couldn't explain without sounding like I was making it all up, because honestly, if someone told me their own family was trying to force sell their house, I'm not sure I would have believed it either. One night, after ignoring yet another call from my dad, I opened my laptop and started quietly gathering information, property law in my state, steps to legally block unauthorized sales, even looking up ways to secure my home and finances. It wasn't a plan yet, but it was the start of one. I needed to know exactly where I stood before they tried their next move. The real gut punch came a few days later when I finally spoke to one of my parents' neighbors. She mentioned casually that Mia and Brandon had been by my parents' house a lot lately, helping with things and talking about how I was thinking of downsizing soon. Downsizing. That was their cover story. They were planting seeds in the neighborhood so that if a sale happened, people would think it was my idea. The manipulation wasn't just aimed at me anymore. It was about controlling the narrative so thoroughly that by the time I fought back, no one would believe my side. That night, I sat in my dark living room. No TV, no music, just me and the hum of the fridge. I thought about everything. How quickly it had all escalated. How my parents had become enablers. How Mia and Brandon seemed to move like they were always 2 steps ahead. And in that stillness, something in me hardened. If they wanted to play this game, they'd find out I was done being the quiet, accommodating one. I wasn't ready to strike back yet, but I knew I needed to start shifting the balance. That meant playing along just enough to make them think I was retreating, when really, I was watching every move they made. So, the next time my mom called, I answered. I let her talk about the good offers they'd heard about how now's the perfect time to sell. I even said, I'll think about it, just to see the trap spring a little further. And in her voice, I heard exactly what I was waiting for, relief. She thought she was winning. But I was already starting to think about what winning would look like for me. And it wasn't going to be quiet. That's when, a week later, I got a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. A person who, without knowing it yet, might be the key to turning this entire thing around. The message came late on a Thursday evening, just as I was about to shut down my laptop. It was from Ethan, an old friend from college I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. Back then, we'd been close, but life had taken us in different directions. I remembered he'd gone into real estate and property law, though I hadn't kept up with his career. His message was short. Heard through the grapevine you've got some family drama involving your house. Call me. For a second, I wondered how he'd even found out. Then I remembered Mia's little downsizing campaign. Clearly, word had reached further than I'd realized. Still, the fact that it reached him, of all people, felt like the universe had just dealt me a card I didn't know I had. I called him immediately. His voice was the same, calm, steady, but with that edge of precision I remembered from the way he used to debate in class. After a bit of catching up, he cut right to it. Lucas, I work with property disputes all the time. If what I've heard is true, you need to lock this down yesterday. I can make sure no one sells, transfers, or even shows your house without your explicit written consent. But we should also talk about, well, leverage. Leverage. That was a word I hadn't allowed myself to think about yet, but hearing it made something in my chest tighten in a good way. We set up a meeting for the next morning, and I hung up with a flicker of hope I hadn't felt in weeks. Meeting with Ethan was like stepping into a different world, one where I wasn't the cornered animal anymore. He laid everything out clearly, filing a legal notice to protect my property, putting my financial accounts under tighter security, even setting up a separate LLC to shield my other assets. It's not just about stopping them, he said, leaning back in his chair. It's about making it so expensive and inconvenient for them to even try that they give up on their own. We got to work immediately. By the end of the week, the property management company that had sent me that letter received a formal cease and desist. Any attempt to move forward would result in legal action. My accounts were updated with new protections, 2-factor authentication, withdrawal limits, and a private alert system that would notify me instantly if anyone tried anything suspicious. But Ethan didn't stop there. He started digging. Not illegally, just using public records and connections. Within a few days, he had a stack of information on Mia and Brandon's financial situation, most of which confirmed what I'd suspected: credit card debt, late payments, and a failed consulting business that had tanked last year. There were also whispers of Brandon owing money to someone you didn't want to owe money to. Having this knowledge changed everything. I no longer felt like I was waiting for the next blow. I was watching them quietly, building a picture of just how deep they were sinking. And the deeper they sank, the more I realized if I played this right, I could not only protect myself, but make sure they could never pull something like this on me again. Meanwhile, I started making changes in my own life. I poured more time into work, and with the stress slowly lifting, my performance improved. My boss noticed. A month later, I got a raise. Nothing life-changing, but enough to remind me that I was moving forward while they were stuck in quicksand. I also reconnected with a few old friends, ones who remembered me as the guy who used to be quick to laugh, not the one constantly looking over his shoulder. Slowly, I started to feel like myself again. But I didn't let Mia and Brandon know any of that. When I saw my parents and they inevitably asked how I was doing, I gave vague answers, even let them think I was still on the fence about the house. It was important they believed I was still in retreat. People get sloppy when they think they're winning, and they were getting sloppy. Ethan tipped me off that Brandon had recently tried to put one of their cars in Mia's name only, probably to hide it from someone else. Their desperation was growing, and desperation makes people careless. I knew it was only a matter of time before they made a mistake I could use. Then one afternoon, I got an unexpected email from a local event coordinator. Apparently, Mia and Brandon were hosting some kind of investment dinner in 2 weeks, pitching a new business venture. The guest list included several people I knew from town. People with money, people they were clearly hoping to squeeze for startup capital. That dinner, that was where things could shift for good. And if I played it right, it would be the night they lost far more than they'd ever hoped to gain. The moment I saw that email about their investment dinner, I knew it was the crack in the wall I'd been waiting for. Ethan and I went over it line by line. Mia and Brandon were pitching some vague real estate redevelopment project, complete with projected returns that were way too optimistic to be real. The flyer had buzzwords like exclusive opportunity and limited investor slots, but nothing concrete. No location details beyond prime properties and no actual development plans. Ethan leaned back in his chair after reading it. This, he said, tapping the printout with one finger, is a problem for them waiting to happen. If they take a single check without delivering on this, it's fraud. And considering their history, I'd bet my next paycheck they've got nothing solid lined up. The idea began forming almost immediately. I didn't need to sabotage them outright. Not yet. All I had to do was be in the right place at the right time with the right information. If I could get eyes on their pitch, I could verify exactly how far they were willing to go to mislead people. And if they crossed that legal line, that would be my golden ticket. I had one obstacle: I wasn't on the guest list. But I did notice something interesting. One of the invitees was a mutual acquaintance, Mrs. Hathaway, an older woman my parents had known for years. She owned several properties around town and was exactly the kind of person Mia and Brandon would drool over for an investment partner. I reached out under the pretense of catching up, and sure enough, she mentioned the dinner. "I'm not sure if I'll go," she said, but it sounded ambitious. That was all I needed. A few careful questions later, she was offering me her spot. "Frankly," she said, "I'd feel better if someone with a good head for numbers looked it over before I committed to anything." I told her I'd be happy to attend in her place. And by the end of the call, I had the date, the venue, and a printed invitation in my name. The following week, I prepared like I was going into a negotiation. Ethan helped me put together a short list of questions that would seem innocent to most people, but would force Mia and Brandon to reveal whether they actually had anything to back up their claims. If they dodged, if they got defensive, if they lied, it would all be noted. And yes, I brought a discreet recording device, not for blackmail, but for protection. I wanted everything documented in case this turned into a legal matter. In the meantime, I made another move, one that had nothing to do with the dinner, but would shift the power dynamic entirely. I refinanced my house under my LLC's name, locking it behind layers of legal structure that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to mess with without my consent. It also meant that if Mia or Brandon were somehow still scheming to get at it, they were now aiming at a target that was legally walled off. 2 days before the dinner, my mom called me out of the blue. "Your sister mentioned you might be thinking about helping them with a new project," she said, her voice hopeful. "If you came in as a partner, it would really show you're willing to put the past behind you." I kept my tone neutral. "I'll see what they're offering." She sounded almost giddy, clearly thinking I was finally folding, but in reality, I was walking into their world on my terms. I'd be surrounded by their potential marks, hearing their pitch firsthand, and gathering every shred of evidence I might need. This wasn't just about defense anymore. It was about building the kind of position from which I could finally hit back hard enough that they'd think twice before ever coming near me again. When the night of the dinner came, I arrived early. The venue was a rented private room in an upscale restaurant downtown. All white tablecloths and low lighting meant to make the evening feel exclusive. A hostess showed me to my seat near the center of the long table, directly across from where Mia and Brandon would be standing to present. I could see the glossy folders at each place setting, each one stamped with the name of their so-called company. As the other guests began to filter in, I kept my expression polite, blending in as just another curious investor. But under the table, My phone was already recording. I wasn't here to make small talk. I was here to listen and to catch them in the act if they overstepped. And judging by the confident, almost arrogant way they walked into that room a few minutes later, they were planning to overstep in a big way. Mia and Brandon entered like they were walking onto a stage they owned. Mia wore a sleek navy dress, all smiles and charm, while Brandon had on one of those expensive-looking suits that you could tell was bought on credit. They worked the room before the dinner even started, shaking hands, laughing too loudly, sprinkling in little comments about how lucky the investors in this room were to be getting in early. When everyone was seated, Brandon took the lead. He spoke with that salesman's rhythm, just enough detail to sound informed, just vague enough to avoid real commitment. "We've identified multiple prime properties ready for redevelopment," he said, clicking through slides of glossy stock images that weren't tied to any actual location. "Our projections show a 20% return in the first year alone." I watched their guests nod, some already intrigued, others politely skeptical. I bided my time until the Q&A section, letting them spin their fantasy uninterrupted. Then, when Mia cheerfully asked if there were any questions before we pass out the sign-up sheets, I raised my hand. "Can you tell us the exact addresses of these prime properties?" I asked, my voice even. The room quieted slightly, just a subtle shift, but I could feel the air change. Brandon blinked. "Well, due to confidentiality agreements with the current owners, I cut in gently." "Right. But without specific properties, how can investors verify zoning, redevelopment feasibility, or ownership records? Especially since some of the photos in your presentation are stock images, like this one." I tapped the glossy folder in front of me, flipping to a picture of a modern building. "This is a hotel in Vancouver. I found it in under 30 seconds on Google Images." Mia's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "The images are for illustrative purposes only. We're protecting our clients' privacy." I nodded like I understood completely, then tilted my head. "Of course. And the projected 20% return. How did you calculate that without fixed property costs, contractor bids, or municipal approval timelines?" My tone stayed calm, almost curious, but I could see Brandon's jaw tightening. A man 2 seats down cleared his throat. "Yeah, that's a good point. Do you have documentation we can review before committing?" The domino effect was immediate. Others began murmuring, asking about permits, escrow accounts, past projects. The easy atmosphere Mia and Brandon had built started to crumble, and I just sat there, letting the questions roll in, occasionally nudging them further. Brandon's answers got shorter, sharper. Mia tried to redirect the conversation to trust and vision, but the investors weren't buying it anymore. One woman flat out said, "If you can't show us a single property or contract, I'm not putting a cent into this." Then came the final blow, one I hadn't planned, but had ready just in case. When Brandon muttered something about people spreading false rumors about their finances, I pulled out a printed copy of their most recent LLC filing, which Ethan had dug up. "Interesting," I said lightly, "because according to public records, your company was only registered 3 months ago, and it's currently listed as at risk for failing to file required disclosures." I set it on the table right next to my untouched wine glass. "Care to explain?" Silence. You could have heard a fork drop. Mia's face flushed, and Brandon's eyes darted toward the exit. A couple of guests quietly gathered their things. The older gentleman at the head of the table said, "I think that's enough for me," and stood to leave. One by one, the rest followed. Within 5 minutes, the exclusive investment dinner had dissolved into a cold, awkward shuffle out the door. I stayed seated until the last guest left. Mia finally snapped, her voice low and shaking. "What are you doing here?" I leaned back in my chair, meeting her glare without flinching. "Making sure no one else gets dragged into your mess." "You should thank me. I just saved you from promising returns you can't deliver, which, by the way, is fraud." Brandon took a step forward like he was about to say something, but I stood calmly, gathering the folder and my phone. "Oh, and this whole thing?" I gestured to the now empty room. "Recorded every word. In case you get any ideas about blaming me for your failure tonight." I walked out without another glance back, but as I reached the door, I heard Mia's voice. Tight, furious, not directed at me. "This is your fault," she hissed at Brandon. "You weren't ready." It was the first time I'd ever heard them turn on each other, and it wouldn't be the last. Over the next few days, the ripples from that night spread fast. Word got around in the small business circles in town, investors' talk, and the story of an investment dinner that collapsed under basic questions was too juicy to keep quiet. By the weekend, Mia and Brandon's names were quietly blacklisted from several local networking groups. The kind of people they depended on for handouts now crossed the street to avoid them. Ethan called me 2 days later with the best news yet. One of the attendees filed a formal complaint, he said, his voice almost gleeful. State regulators are looking into their business. If they can't provide documentation, and we both know they can't, they could face fines or worse. He also mentioned that my recording from the dinner was now in the hands of a very persistent investigator who had a particular interest in cases like theirs. It wasn't just professional fallout. My parents, who had been cool toward me for weeks, called in a panic one evening. My mom's voice trembled. "Your sister says people are spreading lies about her. She's in tears. You have to help clear this up." I stayed silent for a long moment before saying, "Everything people are saying came from her own mouth. I didn't have to make anything up." There was a pause. Then my dad asked quietly, "So, it's true?" I didn't answer directly. "You should ask her." I hung up before they could say anything else. That was the last time they tried to pull me into her defense. Within a month, Mia and Brandon had quietly moved out of their upscale rental and into a cramped apartment on the edge of town. Their real estate company was officially dissolved in state records for failing to comply with basic filing requirements. Brandon, from what I heard, took a job he swore he'd never do, working for someone else. Mia stayed off social media entirely, which for her was like vanishing from the planet. As for me, life settled into a calm I hadn't felt in a long time. My house was secure, my finances untouchable, and my ties to their chaos severed. I still saw my parents now and then, but our conversation stayed polite and surface level. They knew better than to bring up helping my sister again. One afternoon, I was leaving a coffee shop when I spotted Mia across the street. She saw me too. For a moment, it looked like she might come over, but instead, she just stood there. Her expression a mix of anger and something else, recognition, maybe, that she'd finally run into someone she couldn't manipulate. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just got in my car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving her standing on the sidewalk. Because for the first time in my life, I knew I wasn't the one carrying the weight anymore.